So the first idea I wanted to talk about was sort of ideas that will continue to come up across the course of the semester. Key ideas in the idea of human development. The first one, first idea is this idea of the nature versus nurture debate. Okay? Is it the nativist perspective that hereditary factors, our genes, our biological endowment, what we're born with, what goes into us genetically, biologically, these things are the primary influences of our development. These are the things that make us work and influence the way that we develop. Or the nurturist perspective, the environment shapes us. The environment that we are born into influences our development. So the nature versus nurture. And I have a picture there of the psychology majors might recognize that picture. Anyone recognize that picture? Remember what it is?
I did a study with monkeys to figure out something about like touch, and I don't remember it exactly, but I know they had like a terry cloth mother, and then I guess the wire mother, and they found that the monkeys with the terry cloth mother, I guess developed better or something like that. I'm not exactly sure of that. The outcome of it.
That's essentially the idea. Harry Harlow was a psychologist who ran these experiments, and it was really, it had to do with something we're going to be talking about, the early environment, the importance of the attachment to the mother, the importance of the early environment, the importance of the environment on our behavior and our interaction with the world, our development. Next slide. I think as we increasingly develop the science, which is going just like amazingly fast these days, our ability to observe the brain in action, through MRIs and fMRIs and PET scans and CAT scans and so on. Our ability to do all the sort of genetic testing and understand the science these days, the nature argument really has become compelling. We can increasingly see the interaction between what's happening in the person's brain and what's happening with the person's behavior. So certainly strong evidence for the nature side of the argument. But at the same time, we've consistently seen that the importance of the environment. And twin studies, just another thing I wanted to point out, there's evidence from twin studies that there's a genetic component to the development of specific speech, language disorders, autism spectrum disorders. You read about that in some of the readings I gave you. Other interesting connections we're finding by studying fraternal and identical twins have to do with personality traits like happiness, loneliness, neuroticism, things like that. They've determined, for example, by asking identical twins who are separated and doing that sort of research, they've determined that happiness is about, this is a little fuzzy, but basically about 50% genetically determined. So how you view the world and how your sort of set point for what is an acceptable level of happiness, a pretty significant amount of that is determined by your nature, your biology, your genetics. On the other hand, though, there are things that we can do to increase our level of happiness. We know that from success with cognitive therapy, positive psychology, things like counting your blessings, basically being aware of the good things that are going on in your life, and there's like there are techniques for that you can actually practice. I'll do a little therapy with you right now. if every night you go home and before you go to bed, you say, I'm thankful for 3 things, and you identify 3 things to be thankful for. Okay? You do this every night. And they've basically shown that over time, as it changes the way you're thinking. It makes you more, think about the things that are going well. It makes you focus on your blessings or the things that are positive in your life, and you have a increased happiness. So there's the nature and there's the nurture, but in the end, or at this point, the conclusion is that both are important. Okay? Biology can set limits, general limits on what we can do, but we also know that an adaptive, nurturing, positive environment can really make a difference too in terms of human development. Okay. Second debate has to do with how we have studied and how we are studying human development. Basically, the method of research, how we try to answer these questions affects the answer. And if you think about, we'll talk about like Sigmund Freud tonight, a couple times, it turns out, both classes. You're going to be sick of Freud by the end of the night. But Sigmund Freud came up with a theory of development based pretty much on talking to adults. Okay? And then other people came along, we'll be talking about later on tonight, who observed children. And then over the past century, the methods of answering these questions have developed. And as I said, we've got tremendous and fast-growing technologies for studying the brain of living people and understanding the interaction of the brain and behavior and things like that. So we're looking at the theories from 100 years ago, and we're looking at them in the context of our understanding today, our research today. There are different ways of looking at questions. There are behavioral scientists, there are brain scientists, there are all kinds of researchers looking at these questions from different perspectives, and the way that we approach the questions affects the answers that we come up with. Third idea is this issue of is development a continuous process, or is it a discontinuous, stepwise sort of process? Do people develop along a continuous trajectory, or is it an idea of first you have to achieve or master this set of skills before you can move on to the next set of skills? For example, again, we'll be talking about Freud and Piaget and some of these stage-based theories of development tonight. People who said, first you have to get through this and master this and develop these skills or these ideas before you can move on to the next stage. Okay? And then there are the other theories, like behaviorist theories, that say basically learning is a process, and once you figure out learning, the steps are the same, and you just apply them to the next sort of thing that comes up, and we just continually do that. So development is a continuous rather than a stepwise sort of issue. Recent studies have shown that it's, again, as it has been with all of these, it's a little of both. Some things are stepwise. Sometimes we build and then we move on to something else, and sometimes things are continuous. The same elements help move us along in a more continuous path. Okay. That's it for the issues that we'll see come up again and again in this course. We're moving on to the question now of how do people develop and grow. The development of a child, of a human, involves a series of tremendously complicated events. And I think if you're like me, as you did this reading, you were really struck by the complexity of what we're talking about in basically everything we're talking about tonight. The process of early childhood development. Tremendously complicated. each influenced by the interaction of the individual with the social, physical, chemical, cultural, individual with the environment. Okay. We're going to talk tonight about, basically, in this first hour, 3 things: genetics, and then reproduction, and then early childhood development. I wanted to talk a little bit about genetics. From a rehabilitation, counseling, disability perspective, this is increasingly becoming a hot topic, a topic that people feel very passionately about. We're going to talk about why, but basically the issue is we're learning more. We learn more, we're faced with more complex, difficult ethical questions. Okay, we completed the Genome Project. We understand a lot more about human genetics than we did even 5 years ago. Okay? And we're learning it again at an amazingly rapid rate. As we learn, our abilities increase, the questions become more difficult. And that's sort of the point we want to make. We're going to look at 3 issues. Genetic counseling. I want to talk a little bit about that from a rehabilitation counseling perspective, not too much, but just sort of introduce the idea to you, because it's very possible that some of you could be involved in probably referring people to a genetic counselor or working with people at the same time that they are working with a genetic counselor. So I just wanted to talk quickly about what that is. I want to talk about the issues in prenatal diagnosis, and talk a little bit about genetic testing and genetic engineering and gene therapy, and where we are with that and where's that going. So what is a genetic counselor? That's a question for you.
Is that someone who helps you try and pick out what kind of child you want from the genes from 2 parents? Kind of the traits you want, things like that.
It could be. That's one way of thinking about it. Yeah. Rob?
Well, genetic counselors typically are involved in the clinical setting. When, if you're asked for a genetic screen, they come in and speak with the parents involved and say, well, they have a particular probability of getting this, this, and this, and it may just be certain eye color, hair color, or it could also be you have a better chance of getting Down syndrome, that sort of thing. And then the counsel and help provide information on those disorders.
Right. Good. That's basically it. I think this was one of those ones you have to hit the button. Go ahead and hit the button 4 times. And any of you could become a genetic counselor. There are MS programs available in genetic counseling. But basically, as Rob said, what they do is they collect, through doing a detailed history with the couple or the individual, they collect a lot of information about the history of the family, how people died, what illnesses they had, that sort of thing. They may also collect biological samples and do analyses. But people might see a genetic counselor before or during pregnancy to discuss factors that might increase the chance for having a child with a birth defect or genetic condition. During childhood, if a child is born with a genetic condition, to help better understand the reason a child has the condition. And during adulthood, to discuss the likelihood for developing conditions that are hereditary and may occur later in life, like cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, Huntington's, and so on. Information from the American Board of Genetic Testing. You read a little bit about amniocentesis, chorionic villus sampling, and prenatal diagnosis. amniocentesis. It's basically a test that involves inserting a needle, usually around the 14th or 15th week of pregnancy, collecting a sample of amniotic fluid. Chorionic villus sampling is taking a sample from the outside of the placenta. And I have a couple pictures in the next slides. And then conducting tests on these samples for sometimes gender, but as you know, we talked about, we've gone through some pregnancies recently in my family. Some of you have. It's sort of discussed as a test for Down syndrome and other genetic conditions was really the way it was presented by the physicians that we talked to. Okay. It is there are always risks associated with invasive procedures, and these are both invasive procedures. And a number of non-invasive blood tests are currently being developed. So in the near future, maybe these may become a thing of the past, but currently, if a woman is pregnant, she's likely, in my experience, to be presented with the option of having one of these tests. Okay. Go ahead and look at that. Amniocentesis, as I said, is a collection of fluid from within, and then the next one, the chorionic villus sampling. Transabdominal procedure is the ultrasound to see where they are, and they collect a sample, again with the needle, and just the outside area of the placenta there. All right, genetic testing. It's become, if you haven't noticed, it's actually become something that all of us can become involved in. There are about 1,000 companies. When my information was fairly recent this time, there were about 1,000, I think 2009 from the Human Genome Project, about 1,000 genetic tests available from testing laboratories. And in the U.S., there are no regulations in place for evaluating the accuracy, reliability of these tests. So these tests are available commercially. They are not regulated by the FDA. I know a few states, but only a few states have developed state regulations or guidelines for these. Again, the fact that so recently we have developed the ability to do genetic testing on this sort of scale leads to the question of where we're going with it. All right, if we can test and do genetic testing, and people can find out whether their child is going to have a genetic condition or going to develop Alzheimer's disease, as was the case here, later in life, if they have the gene for that. If people can determine eye color and hair color and so on, then people start thinking about designer babies, and we are actually arriving at that point that was science fiction not too long ago, where people can really make decisions about what kind of baby they want to have to some extent. Don't forget environment, nature, nurture. But I was reading this paper. I thought this quote was relevant and interesting, although it may border on stating the obvious. I want to suggest that eugenic practices are widespread in our culture. Remember, we talked about eugenics last week. Very different time, very different context, but this is putting it in a more modern context. Earlier this year, for example, we had the news that prenatal genetic diagnosis was used to select an embryo without the gene for early onset Alzheimer's, resulting in a disease-free baby born to a woman who has a gene for a specific form of Alzheimer's. And so on. And that's, that was 2002, that's several years ago. So So as I said, it raises a lot of questions, and a lot of disability advocates are getting involved. This is a picture of a protester at Princeton in 1999 when they were hiring Peter Singer, the ethicist, and the pass around the article. But basically what Peter Singer was talking about was the quote here: "Killing a defective infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person." He wrote in one book, "Sometimes it's not wrong at all." And he has written about the idea that basically even after birth, parents should have the right to euthanize an infant born with a significant disability. That's paraphrasing, maybe not exactly Peter Singer's words, but Princeton hired Dr. Singer. There were, and there have been since, protests like this about, what he was talking about. I'm going to pass this article around. Looking at it. Again, it's 10 years now, but he's still at Princeton, and the protests are still going on. One more, I think. I wanted to introduce you to Gregor Wolbring. Gregor is he tells us here, he's a biochemist and a bioethicist. Brilliant fellow, and I had the chance to meet him and attend one of his presentations late last year. And he was talking about sort of where this is all going, where technology and genetic technology are going in the context of disability. He founded the International Center for Bioethics, Culture, and Disability, and founder of the International Network on Bioethics. I gave you his web page there. He is a wheelchair user. He is this is his self-description, a thalidomide. What would he be meaning there, calling himself a thalidomide? Thalidomide.
His mother was given thalidomide during prison.
Remember the thalidomide? Never heard of it?
What purpose again?
Morning sickness?
Yeah, it was a medication being given to women for morning sickness, and I think it had been approved in Europe.
Yeah, it was in Canada too.
In Canada, and basically then they realized that it caused all these birth defects, things like missing limbs and a lot of serious birth defects. And Gregor is a person who has who's a thalidomide. His mother used thalidomide, but his webpage and his presentation were fascinating. And what he was talking about in the presentation that I attended was the idea that technology very frequently is new technology is tested with people with disabilities and developed in the context of disability treatment, for example. Remember last week I said when we have a war, we have developments in medicine and rehabilitation. When new technologies become available, frequently they become available for or are tested with people with disabilities. Things like treatments for Alzheimer's, things like what do you call them? Prosthetics. He was talking about, for example, just to give you an example, it's a very sort of, he's a brilliant guy, and some of what he said was a little up here for me, but it's what I got. The idea, in the Paralympics, those blade prostheses, and remember there was the fellow who wanted to run in the Olympics, and he used those prosthetics, or like blades, you know what I'm talking about? Lower limb, and they said no, he couldn't. The blades actually potentially could allow them to run faster. Okay? And Dr. Wolbring was talking about the idea that in the future the prosthetics, and this is an example, could become so good that humans become better with prosthetics than they are without the prosthetics. And then it becomes more exciting to watch people running faster and jumping higher. And instead of watching the Olympics, everybody's now watching the new Olympics. Only here's the thing: he basically there's a shift then eventually for people with disabilities to people with disabilities can't even afford the technology anymore, can't get access to the technology anymore. And medications for Alzheimer's become cognitive enhancers that are used by people who are wealthy enough to afford the technology or the medication. So fascinating ideas. And I encourage you to visit his web page and take a look. And I also encourage you to ask me to send you the nanotechnology survey. Because what he's doing right now is surveying rehabilitation professionals about their beliefs and values and ideas about nanotechnology. Okay, another really fast developing science, and an area in which he works. And he asked me to include, I asked him for permission to talk about them. He said yes, but also throw in my survey there and ask your students to do it. So a lot of tough questions in the area of genetics. Moving on to reproduction. And what I'm going to say about reproduction is we're not going to spend too much time talking about reproduction because I assume that you have, because I know my 5th grader and my 8th grader are learning about reproduction. I'm assuming that you've had some of that science before. And the other thing is you'll be talking about it again in the next week lecture. But we'll say a few things. The development of a child, again, involves a series of tremendously complicated events. What always strikes me in the reading and learning about reproduction is the sort of tremendous odds that are involved. You have a 300 million sperm. That's the population of the United States, roughly, right? And the odds of making it are, probably the population of this building at noon. Okay? So I look at my children and I think 1 in 300 million. Look at all of you, 1 in 300 million. Each one with individual genetic material. Okay? Meets up with an egg that was developed in the mother before she was even born. It's a fascinating idea. Assistive reproductive technology is something I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about again, but it is important as rehabilitation counselors that we think about it from the perspective of, again, you may be working with people who have spinal cord injuries or other disabilities or injuries that make reproduction impossible, basically, without artificial reproductive technology. Again, this is something that we'll be talking about later in the semester. That came up in the reading. The various methods that are currently used for fertilization outside the body, and the methods that are either in the future or are already here, things like ectogenesis, the actual development of the fetus, an embryo and fetus, completely outside of a mother, of a human. Cryopreservation, preservation of materials through freezing. It's materials that cytoplasm transfer and cloning, things that you read again about that again I think are going to become are already now are going to increasingly become ethical issues and debates in your professional careers, and things that you may well be talking to people about, to clients about in your future. sort of skipping lightly over that for today. Moving on to brain and embryonic development. Any questions, comments so far? Went too fast? So we are going to spend a little time talking about this amazing process, the development of the embryo and fetus, which if it doesn't blow your mind, then you haven't been thinking about it. Amazing process. Within 1 week of fertilization, the growing group of cells splitting and forming every 10 to 12 hours becomes a blastocyst, roughly 100 cells. And I think, go one more slide. So there was a lot there. The inner cell mass becomes everything that you are eventually going to become. At that point in the stage of our development, we're talking about a specific kind of cell that you might have heard about. Basically, we're talking about stem cells, which have got so much attention lately. There are other places where we find stem cells, but within the blastocyst, we're talking about these undifferentiated cells, which through a variety of genetic, chemical processes, hormonal cues, intercellular communications. So a lot of processes basically tell these cells eventually where to go and what to do, and as they split up and they become differentiated, meaning they turn into the kind of cell that they're going to be. The blastocyst turns into basically almost a donut shaped ball with a hole down the middle, where eventually the hole down the middle, the donut hole, will become your gut, your intestinal, your what do you call that system, Rob?
The GI system?
The stuff you eat. What?
The gastrointestinal?
Gastrointestinal system. The donut will become your circulatory system, your skeletal system, your muscular system. Okay? It's amazing. These cells, undifferentiated cells, will eventually become these three incredibly complex systems, and then that outside neural plate that becomes the neural groove, that becomes the neural tube, becomes your brain and nervous system. Fascinating. But these stem cells, as I said, you've been hearing a lot about these, a lot of politics involved, because why? What can we do with stem cells? What do stem cells do besides turn into in this context, turn into an embryo? Used for research in potentially curing, treating diseases, and the idea, as I'm not a stem cell researcher, but as I understand it, is these cells can be implanted and can be turned into brain cells and replace or repair damaged or defective cells in the brain or any part of the body. They're cells that can turn into anything. So a lot of excitement, a lot of potential in the research in stem cells. But as I was saying, neural development within 20 days of development, 20 days post-fertilization, we start to see the development of the early nervous system. The neural plate turns into the neural groove, turns into the neural tube, which will hopefully develop into the nervous system. Here's the part that's just amazing. Think about this. During embryogenesis, which is the process by which an embryo is converted from a fertilized cell to a full-term fetus, brain cells develop at the rate of 250,000 per minute. And there are times in the process of neurogenesis where over 50,000 brain cells are formed every second. 50,000, 2001. It's amazing. We are amazing animals. So the baby, the embryo, is developing all these brain cells, actually developing too many, it turns out. We develop twice as many as we need, and then later on, still early in development, but a little bit later on, we have the process of neural pruning, where the ones that aren't going to be used, basically, are eliminated. During the third trimester, 50% of those cells remain alive. So we're only left with 100 billion. Okay. I think next slide. So just pointing out again the process, the amazing process by which we go from that to the most complex machine in the world. Your brain, consisting of 100 billion cells, which is hard to describe because it's sort of an incomprehensible number. I mean, think of it, if you think of it as like all the trees in the Amazon rainforest, okay? And then you can think of the synapses, the connections between these cells, as all the leaves on all the trees in the Amazon rainforest. These neurons, multiple connections with other neurons, and as the infant and as we learn, as we experience the environment, as we figure out that a reflex actually gets us to the bottle, and so we repeat that, we keep those connections, we develop those synaptic relationships, and just an explosion of neural and synaptic development. Billions of synapses are created in utero during the process of synaptogenesis. A toddler's brain has twice as many connections among the 100 billion neurons as the brain of a fully matured adult. So you've already lost half your brain. Some of you more than that. Thinking about the environment, we know the fine-tuning of the child's talents, basically abilities, behaviors, all that learning occurs between the ages of 3 and 6. At approximately age 5 or 6, the brain has reached 90 to 95% of its adult volume. It's 4 times its birth size. That was. A lot of you had children, have children. That was the most terrifying part about that whole process for me, was to see the size of those heads. They are massive. It's like half the body. It's like a popsicle, isn't it? And then still is. I mean, even with my 4-year-old, it's still big. But then they grow into it. But the brain is like, you might have read. I read it somewhere, but I don't remember the fraction, but it's like a quarter or a third of the body. It's some tremendous amount of the body, and then we eventually grow into it. But this early process of interacting with the environment is a process of, again, keeping the synaptic connections that work, that we learn, produce a positive result. Reflexes turn into purposeful movements, and it's also a process of pruning and getting rid of the synaptic connections in the neurons that don't work. Any of you heard of Maria Montessori or Montessori schools? Maria Montessori was a brilliant, she was a psychologist. She was actually the first woman psychologist in Italy. But she developed a process of education that is Montessori education, and there are a lot of Montessori schools around the world, a few in Lexington. And Maria Montessori stated a long time ago, earlier in the 1900s, that the development of the child during the first 3 years after birth is unequaled in intensity and importance by any period that precedes or follows the whole life of the child. And basically, what we're talking about here is the critical nature of that early environment in terms of the developing early brain. What does plasticity mean in the context of brain development? You heard that term, some of you psych majors? Plasticity. Nobody? It is basically it is this concept of the ability to adapt. Right? If you're going to have damage to your brain, best time to have it, the time you want to have it, is when you are very young, because the brain of the very young child is incredibly adaptive, able to what's the word I want? Develop function in different ways. Okay? And we know that the activities of a child during those early years have a physiological, a visible effect on the developing brain. We know that children who start playing piano, for example, at a very early age, develop neurons in that part of their brain and basically you see activity, you see growth in the area associated with the fine motor development. We know that children who, you've probably heard that the best time to learn a foreign language is when? When very young, yeah, because the brain can adapt, it can grow, it can move things around, and this is the period in our life when we are most able to do that, when our brains are the most plastic. The architecture of each human brain is altered as a result of the newly acquired skills and competencies. If you read about kids watching TV, did you read that part? I found that very gratifying because I've always hated the Teletubbies. That one has always scared the hell out of me. And they didn't mention Barney, but I didn't let my kids watch Barney either. But they talked about
Baby Einstein either. So.
Did they talk about that one?
They didn't describe it.
But what was good? There were some good shows. They talked about, we won't make it commercial, but there were some good shows that did what? What were the shows that they talked about as having a good effect?
Interactive.
Yeah, they were interactive. They involved language, thinking about, responding, teaching vocabulary. And the kids who watched those shows developed a more extensive vocabulary, right? And the kids who watched the Teletubbies didn't. That's all I'm saying. Okay? But the point is, the early environment. This is when all the neural pathways are being laid out. Very, very important time in the life of a human. And that's just in case you haven't seen one. That's a human brain. And we are almost coming up on a break. Just wanted to talk for a minute about birth defects and the causes. Again, we'll be talking about these next week with Dr. Soares, I believe. But interesting to be aware, aware of this, birth defect of the heart and circulatory system affect more infants than any other type of birth defect. They're not the ones you hear about. But if you look at the next slide, the structural metabolic calling them birth defects here, conditions are actually much more prevalent than the ones that we tend to hear more about. But I am going to give you this chart, okay? It's very small print, and I'm going to give you a copy of this, just to give you sort of an idea of like how frequently these things occur. Didn't want to spend a lot of time on that. Did want to talk quickly about the causes. Again, as rehabilitation counselors, we have some responsibility for understanding the causes of birth defects. About 10% of problems can be birth problems can be traced to a specific agent, environmental agent, drug, medication, biologic, nutrition factor. About 20% are inherited, but the majority are, we don't know the etiology, we don't know the cause. Etiology means cause. But we do know there are some things we need to be very careful about during the period of development. To be classified as a teratogen, we're talking about chemicals that cause significant structural or functional abnormalities in the developing fetus after either direct exposure or exposure to the pregnant mother. And we talked about teratogens, we talked about critical periods and sensitive periods. The critical period is basically if the teratogen is present during a critical period, there is going to be an effect. If the teratogen is present during a sensitive period, then the odds of an effect are increased. Okay? So critical period, there will be an effect on the developing fetus. The book talked about the effects of various drugs, the alcohol, smoking, marijuana, cocaine, and so on. But the one that I want you to be particularly aware of is not a slide. So let me tell you. Medication. Okay, medications. A lot of the medications that our clients, adult clients are going to be taking, child clients are going to be taking, are in fact teratogenic. A lot of the medications used for epilepsy that have then become medications used for what other conditions?
They give you that at your last trimester to stop contractions. A drug that's for seizures.
Right, and yeah, a lot of significant, potentially significant effects from the anti-seizure medications. But what I was saying is a lot of the medications that were originally used or developed for epilepsy, for seizures, are now being used to treat bipolar disorder, a lot of other conditions. Anyone remember any other conditions?
Isn't it schizophrenia?
It can be mood disorders, yes, schizophrenia, basically a variety of other disabilities. And then obviously there are other medications that are potentially teratogenic. And a lot of times the physician will discuss that with a woman, a couple who are thinking about becoming pregnant, but it's certainly conceivable that a person wouldn't be aware of the potential effects of medication during pregnancy. So it's important that we're at least aware of the potential, that we're thinking about that. If we have questions about that, if somebody came in to us as a rehabilitation counselor and said, what are the effects of this MS medication, I'm thinking about becoming pregnant, what's the correct answer?
I don't know.
Even if you do know. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you think you do, but no matter what, the correct answer is talk to your physician. Identify a physician who can answer that question. And when we're going to move into a few theories of human development, childhood development, really. Childhood is an interesting idea. Certainly it is a culturally defined idea. Historically, it's been defined very differently from how in America we define it, in 2009, which is different from how it's defined in 2009 in other places. But there have been times historically, apparently prior to the 1700s, where childhood was really not even a concept that was commonly understood. It was more like children were basically little adults, and at least in the Western world, when you think about what people were doing, how they were spending their lives, that sort of makes sense. I mean, first of all, people didn't live as long, but also people were basically working. Education wasn't an issue. So, you know, if you look at the activities that people were involved in, basically as soon as you could help on the farm or help around the house, you were helping around the house. And this idea of a sort of a developmental period before adulthood didn't really exist. So in the relatively new idea of childhood, even in the theories we're going to be talking about, we'll be beginning with Freud's theory. You see basically some theories talk about childhood as childhood as a child as a little adult, and then sometimes you see childhood as a developmental pre-adult period in the child's life. If you think about what happened around the time that Freud was talking about his theory of childhood development, really talking about a period, the Industrial Revolution was going, education was becoming mandated in the U.S. in the early 1900s. You see a real shift in society from that agrarian, farm-based way of living to more moving toward the sort of society we have today, where children go to school really to prepare. Originally, the idea was to prepare for work, and probably still. But moving toward a sort of societally recognized, again in the West at least, recognition that childhood was a developmental period. Kids weren't little adults as we see them and think about them when we think about Victorian era children. Dressed like mommy and daddy. Basically, they were just little grown-ups. But then I think, and this is where I go into personal observation, and I think about kids today, with their activities and their cell phones and their organizers, and a lot of kids today spend their time, they go to school, and then they have music or sports activities, and then they have other educational stuff, and a very sort of organized, planned out schedule. This isn't universal, but a lot of children, I think, live this sort of very almost adult-like, in that respect, life. So I think about, we hear people say, compared to the Victorian era, but then I think, in 100 years, are they going to look back on now and say, we were really treating them like little adults? And I think to some extent, maybe that's the case. And that's just me. There was another thing. Oh, I know, the other idea that's interesting to think about when you think about childhood is some changing ideas about how long childhood lasts and when it starts, and things we're learning about changes in human development. Like we know, for whatever reason, that puberty is starting earlier, younger. Children are entering puberty younger. And then I had been thinking about this, and then I heard another psychologist I was talking to say this in a completely unrelated conversation, but talked about how we don't really think of people as adults until they're like 25, 26 these days, and like more people are living at home longer, living with their parents, and not really taking on adult roles until later in life. So really, I think childhood, adulthood remains a socially determined, very in flux sort of concept. Even today, we're in an increasingly global society. We're increasingly learning about and working at the same time as other societies around the world. Even today, different cultures still have very different ideas about what is appropriate for a child, what is appropriate for an adolescent and an adult, and so it's a very complex idea. speaking of complex ideas, talked about Freud's psychosexual stages, which was basically sort of the first formal theory about development. Again, Freud was writing around the turn of the century, last century. He did present a number of key ideas that have stuck with us, that remain very important. More, basically with Freud, more of the ideas that stick with us and still really important are the ideas that when he was talking about adults. Because a lot of this stuff he said about the development of the child, not so much support, as we'll see. But he did, introduce the idea of the importance of the first few years of childhood development. New idea at the time, and he was really sort of pioneered that. Introduced the concept of stages of development and the idea that you have to proceed through a stage and master the tasks involved in that stage before you can move on and successfully master the tasks of the next stage. And certainly his ideas were for decades, and even with some of the adult-related ideas today, certainly very with us, very part of our society. Go ahead and move on to the next one. Freud talked about the 5 stages of psychosexual development, each dominated by the development of sensitivity in a particular erogenous or pleasure-giving zone. So when we talk about psychosexual development, when we talk about sex in this context is having to do with the an erogenous zone or pleasure-giving zone of the body. Each stage presents a unique conflict that has to be resolved, and unsuccessful resolution, if you don't figure it out during the period where you're supposed to figure it out, then it has consequences for you later on in your personality development. And then really, I don't know why we spend a lot of time on Freud in the psychosexual stages, because as I said, as a developmental theory, it really hasn't stood the test of time. You don't really see a lot of child psychologists talking about development in this context, but it is interesting, and I think maybe that's why we spend time still talking about it. But those of you who have children or who have been children, I'm always, I'm curious if you want to pitch in and say, no, that really did make sense to me, because that's what I was like, or that's what my kid is like. I see that because as a human and as a father, this really didn't make a lot of sense to me. But we'll go ahead and talk about it because it's fun. So 5 stages. The first is the oral stage, from birth to 2 years or thereabouts. And the focus in the oral stage is the mouth and the digestive tract. Basically, the child at this stage is dealing with the idea of satisfaction, getting the needs met, and typically in the context of food, nursing, getting the needs met in terms of hunger, what is self-preserving, and sexual in terms of the erogenous zone, so what is pleasure-giving. And the issue here is, does the child learn that the world meets his or her needs or not? Okay, so does the child live in an environment and develop an idea about the world that the world will meet my needs, and so I can move on and I'm safe and I'm comfortable to sort of progress and explore from there, or not? And for each stage, Freud identified fixations. In other words, if you don't master the task, if you don't develop appropriately through the stage, then the implications for your later personality. And you can go either way. You can have oral receptive fixation, which is people who are maybe overindulged, who had their needs met significant need in this area. Oral receptive personalities are people who are dependent, who are gullible, people who will swallow anything, meaning they're so gullible they'll believe anything you tell them. They just accept everything. Okay, take anything in. Have to contain information, knowledge, goods, and frequently you see in oral fixation. Talked about an oral fixation, so sometimes like talked about smoking, candy eating, chewing on pens and pencils, those sorts of things. But people who are fascinated with putting things in their mouth, basically. Okay. And then the other way you can go is the oral aggressive personality, people who are sarcastic, conversationally aggressive, fighting sort of idea. Okay. People who resolve that stage move on to, in the 2 to 3 year old stage, move on to the anal stage, where the issue is basically toilet training, talking about control of the bowels and the ability to go to the bathroom when you need to. Toilet training is the issue basically, and the idea of self-control. Those of you who have been involved in this, a lot of time it becomes an issue of who has control, the parent or the child, and the fight. And the parent puts the child on the toilet, and the child says, "I'm not going to go, no matter what you do or how long you leave me here." So does the parent win? Does the parent have the control, or And then sometimes the child will go whenever he or she wants to go to show that he or she has control. And so this fight over control, self-control or parental control of this function, the way that the parents react during this stage is critical. So parents who are very praise successes and very encouraging and supportive in this process, you get one result, and then parents who fight and really try and control the process, you get another result. So the fixation here is people who are retentive, people who have a high need for control, and this is very much a popular expression. People are anal retentive, and what sort of people do you think about when you say that person is anal retentive?
Set in their ways.
Hmm?
Set in their ways.
Set in their ways? And what are their ways? So anal.
Usually particular about stuff.
Hmm?
Usually particular about how they, organizations, how they like things done.
Good.
It's like this way or no way. There's no other way.
All right, so very controlling, very organized, very, things have to be in a certain order, a certain way. How many of you are familiar with The Odd Couple, Oscar and Felix? And, Felix is very finicky, very neat, very, OCD.
Yeah.
And then Oscar is actually a good example of anal explosive, very sloppy. Basically, everything is out there, metaphorically speaking. Right? His stuff is out there, messy, sloppy, reactionary, not organized. Just I'll do my stuff the way I want. The phallic stage comes next, 4 or 5 years, and this is the stage where it's satisfaction through genital stimulation, and this is the one where it really gets sort of complicated, and I have to refer to my notes. But basically, this is the stage at which the child becomes aware of the presence or absence of a penis, and either develops an Oedipal complex. The male develops an Oedipal complex where the boy wants to possess the mother, and the father becomes a rival. So the boy, Oedipal complex, develops a possessive love for the mother, wants to basically have a relationship with the mother the way that the father does. Okay? Sees the father as a rival for the affections of the mother, but realizes basically that the father is a lot more powerful and is scared of the father castrating him. So we have castration anxiety. The boy realizes that castration is a real, there's a real potential for castration there, and that's a scary thing, right? So rather than fight the father, compete with the father, we decide to resolve this issue by identifying or becoming like the father. So we resolve this stage by becoming like the same-sex parent, the father in this case, and that way the mother will see in us the traits of the father that, and so will basically love us like she loves the father, but the father and I can identify, and we won't have any of that castration business. If you are a female, then it's a little bit different. Then you develop an electric complex where the girl wants to possess the opposite sex parent, the father, and the mother is the rival. So the girl loves the father. She wants to be like the father. Develops feelings of inferiority over the lack of a penis. May blame the mother. She may blame her mother for lack of a penis, may think that the mother castrated her because the mother didn't have a penis. There's all sorts of confusing possibilities there. But basically, the resolution is similar. The girl resolves the electric complex by becoming like the same-sex parent, identifies with the mother, and identifies with the father as well. So basically the resolution at this stage is you become like the same-sex parent. And the motivation is to have that relationship that the parents have without getting castrated. And then I said, and the rest, like Gilligan's Island, because one of the issues with Freud's stages of development is that it all ends at 12, and Freud sort of says, and then you go from there, you go on from there. The genital stage lasts the rest of your life. And if you think about human development, that doesn't really make sense. There's a lot that happens after age 12, but we'll go in order. The latency stage is from 6 to 12, and it's basically a period of having resolved all those Oedipal and electric complex. We put sex aside for a while, and we get involved in more social, direct our energies toward other things. Redirect energies to more personally and culturally acceptable objects. And then the genital stage from 12 to maturity, sexual energy is invested in friendship, leisure, career development, other things. Okay? So among the criticisms of Freud's psychosexual stage theory is that, as I said, the research doesn't really support that this is happening. There are a few predictions that can be tested because it's hard to do research on these sort of ideas. And as we'll talk about in the next class, a lot of what Freud said is hard to research because a lot of it is, you could say, well, yeah, but it's subconscious, so how would you even know if it's going on or not, because it's not even conscious. So it's hard to basically to refute or prove a lot of Freud's theories. Based on it, the theory was developed based on the biases of the culture, which was a very male-dominated culture, and a real criticism is that Freud basically developed his theories about children by working with adults, not by observing children or interacting with children, but working with adults who were reporting about their childhood. And a lot of the adults that he worked with were adults with emotional issues and not the most reliable collecting of information about children. So a lot of issues with Freud's psychosexual stages. But as I said at the beginning, he did introduce a lot of important ideas. Eric Erickson was an interesting fella. He was a art teacher, and he was an artist and a teacher who became interested in Freud's work and analysis, and went on to become a child analyst, influenced by Freud's work, and developed a series of stages, more focused really on the social development of the child. But his Erickson stages really run sort of parallel to Freud's. Erickson's stages are based on what he described as the epigenetic principle, which means that the mastery of the tasks that we develop at the earlier stages become important building blocks, and we maintain those and we use those later on as we add on mastery of other stages. But basically, we build upon the early stages as we develop. So there's Eric Erickson with his wife Joan, who worked with him quite a bit in his work, and Joan and Eric Erickson said that the conflict and tension are sources of growth, strength, and commitment. And Erickson's stages are really described as a more optimistic view, a more, as I said, a more, basically rather than saying if you don't meet the stages, then these terrible things were happening, Erickson focused more on the fact that the stages, the changes represent a challenge and an opportunity for growth, and sort of an exciting potential there, okay? A potential for growth, strength, and commitment. So we'll look at Erickson's stages. The first stage, the oral sensory stage, was from birth to one, and the issue in the first stage was trust versus distrust. Okay? And basically the issue here was, does the child develop a confidence in his surroundings? It's just like you are today. We rely on some things in our environment to stay the same, and that ability to rely on the supports, to rely on the consistency, allows us to proceed and take risks, because we know that some things are going to be consistent. Okay, and if we lived in a world where things were not consistent and everything changed every day, then we would be basically dealing with the changes every day, right? And we wouldn't be exploring and moving on and developing and growing. And that's basically the issue here, trust versus distrust. Is the environment consistent, supportive, safe? If I turn around and then turn back, is my mom still going to be there? And if I learn by doing it a few times that my mom is always there when I turn back around, then I might be willing to crawl a little bit further away. Okay? So we develop trust in the environment. We also learn in this stage something else that's very important, which is mistrust. Okay? We learn, ideally, that there are some things and some people who should not be trusted. And we need to know that too. So we learn who to trust, what to trust, and who to not trust, if we master that stage. Second stage is the muscular anal, or autonomy versus shame and doubt stage, around 2 to 3 years. Similar to Freud in that the issue here is basically muscular control, growing independence over our bodies, independence, ability to move around, to locomotor, to move around the environment on our own. And is the reaction of our environment, of our parents, is it supportive of that? Do we have the support of our parents to try new things out? Or is it a very controlled environment? And anyone who's been around a 3-year-old, they talk about the terrible 2s, but really I think the 3s is way more challenging, because you have 3-year-olds have developed the physical capacity to run and get out of car seats and 9 out of 10 kids screaming in the supermarket are going to be 3-year-olds because they've learned sort of how to, that they can move around in the world, and they've learned that they can see the candy bars right there, they can get to the candy bars, but they haven't really developed the language skills to interact with the parents, to understand the rules, and it can be a very frustrating stage of development for 3-year-olds and parents. So is it it's this balance between autonomy and the fact that you can do all these things, and whether you're encouraged to do them or not. Okay, the next stage, the locomotor genital stage, the 4 to 5 years old, is the initiative versus guilt, is the issue to be resolved here. Increasing independence from parents and exploration of limits, moving away from dependency and toward meeting our own needs. So basically, increased independence, increased exploration of the world, and are you encouraged to try things out, to push the boundaries, and how do the parents respond to that? You go too far, then you get in trouble, and dealing basically with those issues. Latency stage from 6 to 11 years, and the issue here is industry versus inferiority. The question that the children are dealing with at this stage is, think about what children are doing in this stage. What's happening for 6 to 11-year-olds? Yeah, they're moving out into the larger social environment, right? They're going to school, they're meeting other children, they're meeting new people. The question here is, can I master the skills necessary to adapt and survive? So it's a period of developing social and cultural skills needed to function successfully in society. When originally, when Erickson was talking about this stage, he was talking about developing the skills for work. When you become an adult and working in the world, developing those skills, becoming a part of the world in that way as well. Inferiority results when children are not permitted to develop, when they are restricted from developing in that stage. And even though it is called the latency stage, Erickson recognized and said this is not this is really a very active period in a child's development. Puberty and adolescence, 12 to 18, a period of identity and role confusion. And again, if you think about what people are doing in those years between 12 and 18, thinking about developing the sense of self, their identity. Who am I? What do I believe in? What is my role in the world? That sort of thing. And are they able to identify, to sort of develop a self-identity, an individual identity, and interact with others, or is it a sort of a period of confusion, an inability to interact effectively with others socially? So who am I? And then young adulthood is seen by Erickson as a period really of learning how to develop, say, intimate relationships, but Erickson wasn't really necessarily just talking about intimate relationships and partner relationships, but developing friendships and close social relationships. The person is dealing with those abilities, and basically the issue is, do you learn those skills to develop close social relationships, or do you become very isolated? And then adulthood is basically the career period, how you can think of it, working, developing a career through the age of period of retirement, basically, and it's thinking about being a productive member, developing a meaningful work life, contributing. And also, this is a period where you start thinking about the next generation, contributing to the next generation, and feelings about that, your ability to contribute or not in the case of stagnation. And then maturity is the basically the later years when you're looking back on your life, and the question is, ego integrity versus despair. Was my life meaningful? Did I contribute? And basically reflecting on your life and deciding my life was meaningful, I made a difference, I made good relationships, I contributed to work and so on. Or getting to that point in your life and saying, what have I done? And sort of existential despair. And a lot of times you see people in this stage trying to make up for lost time and engaging in those sorts of efforts to try and find meaning, looking back at life and not seeing it. Do want to make sure we spend some time talking about Piaget. Piaget around the 1920s is where he started to see his work. He was actually a very brilliant fellow, as you'll see. He wrote a novel when he was 11. He's one of these people who finished high school and finished his degrees very, very early in life. Brilliant man. Spent a lot of time actually working with and observing children. And if you've had any sort of developmental psychology, I'm sure you've heard of him and seen his very creative experiments to sort of show the developmental stages that he talked about. He was a pioneer in raising awareness of the idea that children do think differently from adults, that there are different cognitive developmental processes that go on in the early years, and that children are actually different from adults in the way we think about the world. Piaget saw the child as an active agent in development, interacting with their environment and trying to figure it out, sometimes running into conflicts, and he talked about how we deal with those conflicts. But basically Piaget, like the other stage theorists, talked about the fact that children do develop through stages, and you have to sort of master the stage before you can move on to the next stage, I think. In terms of how children develop cognitively, Piaget saw things this way. Talked about the idea of schemas, which are cognitive sets, ways of thinking about the world, and they're generally contextual, so we all have schemas for different things that we do. We have schemas or a way of thinking about driving a car, and we have schemas about all the different activities that we participate in, different social interactions and so on. So a schema is basically a cognitive structure, a way of viewing a situation or viewing the world. Children do an assimilation is, as they grow and they experience more of the world, they collect more information, they collect more experiences, and basically children, and I think all of us humans do this, we try and fit what we're learning and seeing into our schemas. In other words, we try to make the world as we're seeing it make sense, fit into our understanding, okay? Eventually, for children, you come across something that just doesn't fit the schema that you have, so you have to modify your schema, okay? And that process is called accommodation. Go one more. Accommodation is when we develop or evolve a new schema to fit our understanding of the world. That period where we reach the point where this new information isn't making sense anymore, it's not fitting into our schema, Piaget described as disequilibrium, and that tension that is created when this isn't making sense, it doesn't fit into my rules, and so we accommodate, we create a new schema that will fit the new rules and the old rules, we put it all together in a new way. And basically development, cognitive development, is a cyclical process of simulating disequilibrium and then accommodating. Okay. And I was trying to think of some examples, ways of thinking about this with children. And so for example, young children frequently are under the conception that everybody in the world loves them, right? Because everybody in the world for a lot of children is their parents and immediate family and aunts and uncles who come over and friends, and everybody in the world loves them because everyone smiles and happy and laughs at everything they do, right? But so we have a schema, we have a set way for understanding everybody in the world loves me. Okay, but then you meet more people, and then a child might meet a person who's not so much in love with the child, right? So this doesn't fit. This person doesn't love me. So a little disequilibrium, and then eventually you meet 2 or 3 people who don't love you, not so much like you, then, all right, so a new schema. There are a lot of people in the world love me, but some people don't. A new way of understanding the world, for example. And Piaget had developed 4 stages we're going to talk about, and then we'll stop there. The first stage of Piaget's stages is the sensory motor stage from birth to around 2 years old. The child has an increasing awareness of basically the body and space. From 0, when the child is born, and is basically a reflexive, not purposefully moving sort of animal, learning that after trying a reflex a few times, it's successful in, like I said, grabbing the bottle or producing some effect that works, right? The child develops in those first couple of years this set of skills that help him or her understand that if I do something, there will be an effect. If I smile, then my parents will smile. If I cry, then my parents will come running. And then they also develop this idea of object permanence, which is, any of you familiar with the idea of object permanence? Probably some of you have heard of Piaget. A nod? What's object permanence?
Isn't it like when they start to remember like their mom, so if their mom leaves the room, then they might cry or whatever. They start to just remember everything.
Yeah, basically it. So it's the idea that, originally when they're born, the universe is the child and things that are in their immediate environment, but everything basically exists for the child and in the child. The child is the universe. It's a developing idea that those things that are out there in the world are actually separate, different from me, and that they still exist, and then my mom is a separate object, and when she leaves, she's gone, but she will come back, and then she'll be there again. So it's the idea that there are external objects that are permanent and different, separate from me. The pre-operational stage, from 2 to 7, the child develops the capacity to use symbolic representations to represent the world internally. And language is an example of a symbolic way of representing the world. The child is able to think in terms of language, develop ways of thinking about the world using symbols. Still very egocentric at this stage. The child's own point of view is the only point of view, and if you know any children this age, it's pretty much true. Not a lot of empathy, not a lot of putting myself in someone else's shoes. So very egocentric at this period. Concrete operations. Children develop the mastery of logical operations, math, hierarchical structures. So starting to understand the world from a more logical, rule-based perspective. Very rule-based and very concrete. And then the formal operations stage from 11 to older is the increased capacity to think about things abstractly. Like, I think it might be in the movie, but let me give you an example. If I say if I hit the glass with a feather, the glass will break. Okay. Johnny hit the glass with a feather, what happened? Glass broke. And you say that because it's sort of abstract, because you know really if you hit, as my 10-year-old son told me, a feather won't break a glass, right? So he's, you know, you didn't go there. You went a different way because you're a little more, you're thinking more abstractly, you're thinking about things a little more advanced maybe than my 10-year-old. Still in a very, he's a sharp kid though.
I believe that.
But I think the best way to exemplify Piaget's stages is to show you a couple of, again, short YouTube videos